She ruled from a throne of shadow and stone, crowned not by ceremony but by conquest. Queen Citral, sovereign of the Zarkari swarm, gazed across her great hall with the smugness of certainty. Around her, nobles clicked their mandibles in amusement, their exoskeletons shimmering beneath the blue bioluminescence that pulls through the walls like the heartbeat of a slumbering beast. The stench of metal and old blood lingered in the air, as if the palace itself remembered every scream it had absorbed. Before her, shackled in chains designed for execution, stood the last ember of a burned world. Ethan Voss, human, bruised and broken in flesh, but not in spirit. He did not kneel. He would not give her that. His green eyes, bloodied but burning, met hers with something that did not belong in that room: defiance. "You humans," the queen purred, stepping forward, her voice echoing like a cold wind against the stone. "You believe in stories, in turning points, in something called a climax." Her nobles hissed in laughter. The sound was serrated, cruel, but there is no climax here, no crescendo, no hero's return, only the slow decay of your species. Ethan said nothing. Not yet. He watched the queen, measured her, as she drew closer, intoxicated by the sound of her own certainty. She leaned in with mock curiosity. "Tell me, human, is this what your myths promised? Shackles? Silence? Extinction?" And that was when he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man defeated. It wasn't the last gasp of hope before despair. It was the quiet, knowing grin of someone watching the clock tick down to something others couldn't yet see. The queen's expression darkened. "What amuses you?" she hissed. "You talk too much," he said, his voice frayed but firm. Typical villain mistake. And then, the hum began, not from Ethan, not from any visible place. It was buried in the air itself, a vibration, subtle, growing, like the first shiver of a tectonic shift. A red light blinked near the control panel. Advisors scurried. One dared speak. "There's an anomaly." The queen turned sharply. "Explain." "We're detecting signals. Unauthorized." She looked back at Ethan. He raised his bound hands. Chains clinked softly. "I didn't do anything. But my friends, they've been very busy." And just like that, the myth she had laughed at began to breathe. The warning sirens rose in pitch, as if the palace itself had become aware of its own betrayal. Crimson light spilled down the spires, illuminating the sleek carapaces of the nobles now shifting uncomfortably in place. They had known only dominance, only certainty, but now uncertainty began to stir beneath their armored shells. The queen's voice cracked like a whip. "Regain control." But control was already slipping. Advisors clawed at the consoles, mandibles twitching with anxiety. "We're losing systems. Lockdowns are initiating. Unauthorized overrides. Your Majesty, we are being locked out of our own fortress." A deeper hum followed, this time accompanied by something more primal. The walls themselves vibrated, not with impact, but with momentum, movement, something massive, deliberate, and inevitable. The holographic screens behind the queen flickered, and when the image cleared, it wasn't destruction that filled the room. It was revelation. Human ships, not the broken remnants she had torched from orbit, not the desperate relics of a dying fleet, but sleek vessels, obsidian armored, gliding through space like predators. A hidden armada, a fleet she hadn't known existed. Stealth cruisers awakened from deep slumber. Panic rippled through the nobles. Some hissed. Others backed away from the center, uncertain for the first time in their collective memory. The queen clenched her claws, refusing to believe. "Impossible," she spat. Ethan tilted his head, the bruises on his face catching the emergency lights. "Like old battle scars. You celebrated too soon," he said. The story wasn't over. And then the walls shook with the first true explosion, close, intentional, not distant space warfare but an internal rupture. Dust fell from the ancient archways as the foundation trembled. Another followed, stronger. The lights overhead sputtered out, plunging the hall into darkness, broken only by red emergency pulses and flickering holograms, now flooded with corrupted data. "Something is inside the system," the strategist gasped. "Not just hacking us, rewriting us." And yet, amidst the chaos, Ethan remained still, calm, loose, like a man standing exactly where he wanted to be. "I told you," he whispered into the darkness. "You haven't seen the climax yet." The queen moved toward him, fury blooming in her chest like acid. "This is your trick? Your illusion? No illusion, he answered, and the great black stone doors slammed shut behind him, locking without command. System lockdown detected. The queen's display blared in her vision. Strings of code rewritten before her eyes. Her strategist's voice cracked, trembling with something far worse than panic recognition. We're being boarded. And now the myth laughed back. Not with words, but with steel. The queen's rage burst through her voice. Who dares violate my throne? But her strategist only stammered. Intrusion. Levels 5 through 12. Primary power grid compromised. Weapons. Offline. Ethan chuckled, low and soft, like the beginning of a storm. Took them long enough. Her claws lashed out, not to strike, but to reclaim control, psychological, symbolic. She would crush him, break him, and display his bones in the square. But as she moved, something happened that none of them could have expected. The chains fell, not snapped, not cut, released. Ethan stood tall, rubbing his wrists as though he'd merely been waiting for a ride. The hall froze. Nobles gasped their clawed feet scraping back. For a moment, no one breathed. No one dared. I have to hand it to you, Ethan said, stretching slowly. You almost had us. Almost. There were calculations in her head. None of them made sense. He should be bound. The system should be sealed. Power should be under her command. But reality no longer bent to her will. Something had broken. Then came the first death, silent. One of her most loyal guards staggered, his body twitching, his head tilted, not from confusion, but from precision. A blade, invisible, clean, pierced through his armor from behind. The body collapsed. But there was no visible attacker. Panic bloomed like fire. Weapons were drawn. Energy blades hummed. Plasma rifles charged. Nobles formed into a defensive arc. But the hall remained still, empty. Another flicker. Another body dropped. This time the queen caught at a shadow, flickering through air, not walking but gliding, like a ghost that knew every secret door. A human operative. No more than that. A plan. A prophecy. Her claws clenched, mind racing. This is not possible, she shouted, more to herself than anyone else. Her palace impenetrable, her enemies extinct, her power absolute. And yet the tremor came again, deeper, broader. Her strategist fumbled. I can't explain. The screens, the holograms shifted. No longer warnings. No longer Zarkari script. Human language now flooded every interface. One phrase repeated. Not in red, but in electric blue. We were never gone. The queen took a step back. She did not know it yet, but she had already lost. The nobles hissed in unison, their minds refusing what their eyes could not deny. This was not war. It was a rewriting of truth. One by one, guards fell before they could scream. Their armor meant nothing, their coordination a relic of a fading empire. The queen screamed commands, desperate to summon order, but the system no longer listened. A whisper floated through the hall, not a voice. A signal, a countdown. 5. The sound came from everywhere, earpieces, consoles, walls. There was no origin, no source. 4. Citral braced, her mind spiraling, trying to summon the network, the great neural lattice that had always obeyed. But it too had grown silent. 3. Her claws dug into the stone beneath her, a futile instinct of a queen about to drown. 2. She lunged. 1. And then the world fractured. The walls exploded inward, not from outside assault, but from within. White phosphorus ignited in violent bursts, blinding the elite of the Zarkari in a storm of heat and fury. Their compound eyes screamed with light, overloaded by what they could not process. The queen staggered, half blind, half furious, but still standing. Around her, shapes moved with quiet precision. Human operatives emerged from the haze. They did not shout. They did not hesitate. Every movement had purpose. Every bullet sang. And they were not alone. From the broken walls came more humans, not remnants, not survivors, soldiers, commanders, ghosts reborn. The queen froze, her thoughts like shattered crystal. Her mind asked one question over and over. How? She had seen their ships burn, had crushed their colonies, had declared them extinct. But now, they were here, inside the core of her rule, not as rebels, not as martyrs, as victors. And through the chaos walked Ethan Voss, unarmed, unrushed, surrounded by fire, but untouched by it. He looked at her, smiled. You laughed at the climax, he said. But here we are, and not even the throne answered her call. The queen reached for power, for command, for the certainty she had always known. But her throne, the ancient, living core of the Zarkari dominion, shuddered beneath her, not in reverence, in rejection. She felt it first in her limbs. They stopped responding. She tried to rise, tried to scream, tried to summon the force that had once bent galaxies to her will. But the locks engaged neural systems designed to obey only her now froze her in place. Her strategist's voice was no longer confident. It cracked like splintering glass. Your Majesty, the throne has linked to a new authority. She stared at him, unable to speak, unable to move. Not from injury, from betrayal. That's not possible, she whispered in her mind, but it was happening. And Ethan Voss? He didn't even look at her. He watched the screens, the shifting projections. Now showed not battle but surrender. Zarkari warships drifting aimlessly. Colonies rising in rebellion. Entire systems flickering offline. Her dominion was not dying with a scream. It was unraveling in silence. You don't understand, she wanted to say. This is my empire. But the silence answered. It wasn't hers. Not anymore. Ethan finally turned toward her. His steps were slow, not mocking, not gloating, just certain. I've been in a lot of war rooms, he said. Seen fleets clash, watched men bleed for a cause. But this, he glanced around. This is my favorite. She strained against the throne, biotech restraints digging into her flesh, her pride, her soul. And he leaned in. We didn't even have to fight, the palace groaned. The walls themselves pulsing with new life, not Zarkari energy, but something else. Human code, human control. She felt the truth like a knife. The palace, her palace, was no longer hers, and for the first time, she was a prisoner in the very seat she had once ruled from. The screens surrounding her no longer screamed alarms. They told a story, the same story on every wall, every surface, every thread of her once living empire. A story not written in Zar script, but in bold, defiant human code. Checkmate. Not once, not twice. Repeated like a drumbeat. Checkmate, checkmate, checkmate. She wanted to roar, to command, to remind the stars who she was. But the throne refused her. The neural link had been severed, not by force but by invitation. It had chosen another. Her strategist staggered backward, his exoskeleton trembling. The system is responding to new input, he whispered, as if saying it quietly would make it untrue. She felt it, deep in the neural core of her being. The hum, the ever-present current of the swarm was gone. No more commands flowing through the hive, no more harmony of domination. Just silence. The throne room was still burning, yes, but it wasn't fire that undid her. It was the absence of control. She had ruled over 200 worlds, had crushed entire species beneath her heel, had silenced rebellions with a glance. But now, she could feel the emptiness across her entire network. Colonies without instruction, ships without captains, armies built on obedience now drifting in confusion. Her legacy, engineered to be unstoppable, had no soul of its own. Ethan stood in the center of it all, hands in his pockets, watching it fall, not with rage, not with triumph, with clarity. She snarled, the only thing she could still do. Fix it. She tried to command, but her strategist couldn't obey. His fingers flailed uselessly at the console. It's obeying them. She stared at Ethan, her vision darkening with disbelief. How? She wanted to ask. He shrugged, the answer simple. You just thought it couldn't happen to you. And then, the palace itself joined the rebellion. The palace turned its back on her as easily as a shadow turns at dusk. Holograms once loyal to her thoughts now displayed footage of collapse, her own warships dimming. Zarkari strongholds overrun not by armies, but by uprisings. And worst of all, they weren't fighting for humans. They were fighting for themselves. Her swarm was cracking, not from pressure applied to the outside but from within. Her own design was betraying her. She had stripped individuality from her people, sculpted them into tools that obeyed and never questioned. It had worked perfectly until the signal vanished, until they were no longer part of a collective, but just insects with no swarm to hear them. And Ethan? He didn't gloat. He didn't mock. He turned his back on her, because she wasn't important anymore. That silence, the one now drowning her, was louder than any death scream. It was the silence of being irrelevant, of watching your world fall apart while everyone else moves on. She had once dreamed of eternal dominion. Now she was watching the funeral of her legacy in real time. and she could do nothing. She felt the last strands of her network dissolve like mist in a vacuum. The throne's biotech dug deeper, locking her body in place. Her mouth opened, but her voice failed. Even the act of rage had been stripped from her. She had thought extinction was the worst fate a species could suffer, but this was worse. To be alive, aware, and utterly forgotten. And still, the humans did not celebrate, they simply acted. She saw them, rebels, operatives, free beings of every kind, flooding the throne room behind Ethan. They didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her, not out of fear, out of disinterest. The queen who had orchestrated the fall of countless civilizations now sat motionless, unrecognized by those who had come to bury her rule. They were not here for revenge, they were here to rebuild, and she was not part of that future. It should have infuriated her, but all she felt was emptiness. The footsteps that approached were calm, deliberate. Ethan stopped before her again, not with weapons, but with eyes that saw her for what she truly was, now an artifact. She expected hatred, expected the fury of a man whose people she had tried to annihilate. But Ethan didn't hate her, that made it worse. You don't get it, he said softly. You never did. She clicked her mandibles, the only motion her broken throne still allowed. You thought we fought for power, for conquest. You thought war was about submission, about control. But we don't fight because we're the strongest. He leaned closer, voice steady as stone. We fight because we refuse to stop. That truth landed heavier than any weapon she had ever forged. She had believed victory was a matter of inevitability. If you crush hard enough, if you dominate long enough, nothing can resist. But she had never planned for persistence. She had never planned for belief. You thought your empire was perfect, Ethan continued. But perfection is brittle. All it took was a little pressure. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to, because now, the weight of what she had refused to see was pressing down on her, heavier than any chain. She watched helpless, as her empire shattered like a mirror struck from within. The species she had enslaved, the civilizations she had bent to her will, were not kneeling, they were rising. Not under a new banner, not in allegiance to humanity, but in a pure, untethered awakening of will. The humans had not come as conquerors. They had come as pressure, and the swarm had cracked. Ethan had never needed to rally an army. He hadn't needed overwhelming force. All he had to do was push hard enough, for long enough, in the right places. The empire she had crafted for control had become her cage. Every system, every throne protocol, every swarm process turned against her, because she had built it to serve power, not truth. Now she was watching the consequences of her own genius unravel her. The throne exhaled beneath her, a deep, final sound like a dying creature breathing its last. The last neural tether snapped, not with violence, but with a hush. And then, she was alone, truly alone. And no voice in her mind. No hum of the swarm. No access to the eyes and ears of her empire. Just herself. Ethan turned, walking away without a backward glance. He didn't offer words of closure. He didn't look for gratitude. The queen of the swarm was no longer relevant to the moment. The last thing she saw before the doors blew open was her nobles, confused, disoriented, their instincts crippled by the absence of command. They had never been taught how to lead themselves. And the last thing she heard, the unmistakable signal of the true human fleet jumping into orbit, not broken, not beaten, victorious. The end did not come with a scream. It came in silence, the kind that follows truth, not violence. The kind that seeps into bone, into thought, and roots there. Queen Citral had once defined herself by that which obeyed her. Her voice had been the sun around which the swarm revolved. Now, she felt only darkness where the hive had lived inside her. The neural silence wasn't absence. It was negation. She could still see the galaxy unraveling through flickering screens her own command center forced her to watch. Colonies failing, dreadnoughts drifting, generals freezing mid-order. Like puppets with cut strings, her empire, sculpted to precision, had no soul to resist. Without her, it was nothing, but worse. She still existed, still conscious, still present. She had designed her throne to be the axis of her dominion, a convergence of every power line, every neural thread, every breath of empire. Now it was a prison. It had locked her in, not out of malice, but indifference. Ethan returned one final time, his green eyes steady. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. She wanted him to be angry. She wanted vengeance, punishment. Anything to make her feel like she still mattered, but he offered her only understanding. Not for what we did, he said quietly. You earned that, but for what you never understood. He stepped closer. We don't fight for victory. We fight because we believe in the moment where everything changes. That heartbeat when the impossible turns. He smiled, but not to taunt. We believe in the climax. Far across the void, a final explosion rippled through the last of the Zarkari fleet. She felt it not as command, but as consequence. Her vision dimmed. Her legacy dissolved. She had mocked the myth of turning points, but now she lived inside one and it did not belong to her. Ethan turned, disappearing into the light. He did not say goodbye, and the queen, once feared across 1,000 systems, sat silent, not dead, forgotten. The climax had come, and it had not chosen her.